Okay, so thank you very much for being here, first of all. My name is Riccardo Tempesta, and I'm CTO at Magento Specialist. And today, I'm going to share with you a couple of ideas on how to remaster Magento to Frontend using new JavaScript technologies like AngularJS or React.js. We will not see too many technical details because I don't want to bore you too much, but before we understand what we want to do with these new technologies and where we want to go, we should understand where we come from. I know this is very philosophical, but we have to do. So, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, we had Magento 1. The Magento 1 approach was quite simple. You know, we could say it was a monolithic approach. I say monolithic because in a single HTML document, you had both dynamic part and static part. And when I say static, for example, I mean the information that do not change among different users. So, for example, products. The products are almost the same inside one single group of users, for example. And dynamic information are, for example, private information, like your minicart. So in Magento 1, they were just put it together and returned in a single page. What does this mean? Well, it is quite simple if you're a developer. You know that to do this, you have to involve PHP every time you do a page request. But involving PHP is not always a good idea because we all know that PHP is probably one of the worst bottlenecks you have in a web application. So this is why in Magento 1 you could rely on full page cache, FPC, but FPC was only available in Enterprise Edition. And the other problem is that FPC is behind PHP because it was inside Magento. It was not something intercepting the request before Magento, like Varnish was. In fact, the other option was using Varnish, but Varnish, if you worked with Magento 1, was too hard to configure. You know, one does not simply install Varnish. It is very complex. You had to face a lot of problems with ECI block, with updates. For the same reason I told you before, it was because they mixed static content and dynamic contents. So this is why Magento 2 came to a new solution, a very brilliant and simple solution, just to separate them. So we have the static contents that are delivered with a single HTML document as well as Magento 1, but this page is completely missing any dynamic information. So if your eye is fast enough, you have probably seen that the page loads very quickly. And for example, dynamic information like minicart is updated after a few milliseconds. This is why, because you get the static content at the very beginning, and then you have an asynchronous process loading dynamic contents. And this is the solution of Magento 2. So static parts are PHTML driven like it was in Magento 1, but dynamic parts are updated using REST API calls. And these REST API calls are driven by Knockout.js UI components. And the main advantages of this solution are quite clear. So you have a very wide coverage of API REST. We know that Magento 1 was very good about API, but Magento 2 is impressive. You have API for everything from the front end and everything from the back end. And if you do not have, you can easily expand. It's very simple. And most important, you can rely on a real full page cache. This is why Magento 2, for example, behind Varnish, is extremely fast. It's impressive. So, when the standard Magento 2 solution is very good for you if you need a feature-rich and short time-to-market solution just out of the box. So, if you're okay with a standard Magento 2 customer experience. But if you have customers like the one I have, with a very wild imagination about front-end features, you probably need something more. So, for example, if modifying Magento is more expensive than refactoring a part of it, you may consider a new way. So, going headless. And this is the core of my speech, going headless. What does this mean? To decouple front-end from back-end. So, front-end becomes an application consuming back-end REST API services. So, they are just different. This front-end can be even a separate one, not a Magento 1. Everything. This is the power of Magento. You can modify everything inside Magento, but you can even integrate something to work with Magento. But before we understand what are the main advantages of this solution, I want to give you the bad news. So brace yourself. Here go the code. Okay. First thing you should know about area. You know that Magento 2, as well as Magento 1, is divided into different areas. One area could be, for example, front-end, and another one could be admin HTML. So when you want to create a custom, you have to specify for which area this custom will work. What is the problem? The problem is that if you are going to decouple front-end and then using REST API call, we are no more in the front-end area. So we have to make sure that our custom is working for Web API REST. That is a different area. If you're going to work with a standard Magento, you will not have any kind of problem because Magento is well structured from this point of view. But if you're going to install a third-party application or to create your own module, you have absolutely to keep in mind this, unless you want to have a lot of headaches. Another thing you should know, images. Images in Magento 2 work in a different way if compared to Magento 1. Because in Magento 1, you could just specify, for example, image dimension directly inside PHTML file. If you are a Magento, raise your hand if you are a Magento 1 developer. Yeah, a lot. Magento 2? A lot. That's fine. So in Magento 1, you probably remember Mage, Helper, I don't remember what, resize, and blah, blah, blah. OK. You specify dimension directly inside PHTML file. In Magento 2 is different. You just require a kind of image. This kind of image, in my example, is category page grid. You see in the code. This category page grid is a symbol defined inside view.xml file. But this file is not available in Web API REST area. So it will not work. So this code will not work for REST API. So if we want to get a resized image in Web API, we have two different solutions. The first one is to send back the request to a front-end controller, so we get back to the front-end area. And the second one, I don't like this one, but okay, it is working anyway. The second solution is to work around the problem, so just to specify the dimension as well as Magento 1. It is the same way of Magento 1, but just remember that our coding something like image dimension is not always a good idea. So just keep this in mind. The first solution is probably the best one. And I don't know if a solution will come from Magento, because Magento, as far as I know, is investigating on improving REST API power and coverage. So something could probably come from them directly. And the other thing you should know, and this is very important and this is very tricky, URL mapping. When you're going to send a request to a decoupled front-end, you're not going to send a request to backend Magento. You're going to send a request to the decoupled front-end. It's a different application, and this application is not aware of URL structure behind. So, for example, if you're requesting a product page, the decoupled application doesn't know if that page corresponds to a product or to a CMS page, and what product and what CMS page. So what we have to do is to create a two-step system. So first of all, we have to request what kind of resource we are going to view, to request. And the second one is to request details about this resource. So just to make an example, a couple of examples. The first one is an idea on how to get information about Stripe shoulder pack.html. So this application should respond with resource type product. So we know it is a product, and resource ID and the ID of the product. And the same for a CMS page. This is very tricky, probably the most tricky part of decoupling Magento. The last but most important is to mine the cache. We are talking about front-end, so performance, performance, performance. But Magento 2 REST API cannot rely on a caching system. So we cannot have a very responsive front-end with slow API. This is almost nonsense. So what we have to do is to find a way to apply a caching system to an API call. We have two main solutions. One is coming from SunderMangle. Sander Magel created a very structured software that allows to integrate Magento with a lot of other software. It's a very complex software, but inside the software you have a caching system for Magento REST API. This is an external software, so you put this in the middle between Magento and the client. And the second solution comes from my company. It's a free module. You can find it on GitHub. It's called API Enhancer. It's probably the best solution because it's probably a simple way to fix this problem, because it is a Magento 2 module you can just install with Composer, and it creates an integration between API system and caching system. So you can use, for example, REST API calls with Varnish, and it's very fast. So now we have seen problems. Now we have to see how we can introduce problems in our life. So we found 3 main candidates for this revolution: React, Angular, and Vue. I want to say, I do not want to start a war between frameworks, because choosing a framework is, most of the times, is a matter of fashion. You know, this year is React, next year is Angular. There is not a best framework, in my opinion. You have to understand what are the main differences, what are the common parts, and then choose the best one for you. To help you understanding which one is the best for you, I can just say what are the main differences. So I think the main differences between these 3 frameworks is the binding model. So let's start with React 1, because React 1 is probably one pattern you didn't see before. React is a very strange library, and a very powerful library. It is just a rendering library. This means that you do not have any kind of logic inside. You just have a rendering engine, okay? And it works like a deterministic network. Raise your hand if you know what a deterministic network is. I was sure, no one. Okay, because it's very strange. Or a pure network, but you probably know what a pure function is. A pure function is a function that, depending on the input values, returns always the same value. So a pure function example is a plus b. If we know a and we know b, we know the result of this function. So if a is 2 and b is 4, we know that is no 1, 6. Yeah, 6. Wow. I was joking, I was sure no one was answering. An example of non-pure function is, for example, getTime. Every time you call this function, you have a different result, okay? And React works in this way. So the view accepts one input that is called application state, and every time you change this input, you have a different output. But this output is always the same with the same input. So when you want to change something inside the view, and you have, for example, an input text, you have to raise an action, calling a dispatcher, changing the input of the view, and giving back this input to the view. And the view gets updated. This is called Flux. Everything is a stream. Here we go with philosophic stuff again, but it's something like a stream. The opposite way is the two-way binding. You probably know better because it's the basic model, for example, in Knockout.js. This model is typical in systems that are not only rendering libraries, but are, for example, MV something. So, for example, MVC or MVVM. You probably heard about this kind of patterns. I can just explain with an example that I think is more clear. Here we have a piece of code of an Angular piece of code, an HTML file. So we have an input text with a variable QTE, quantity, okay? And we say, this variable is connected to my model. Now we do not have the model class here, but in our model class, QTI is a variable, is a property of this model. When we change the property inside the model, we get this updated inside the view. And when we change the view, we get it updated inside the model. So this is why you have this kind of feedback. So the model updates the view, and the view updates the model. It is the same pattern you have, for example, with the observables in Knockout.js. If you are working with Magento 2, you know how to work with them. But this is very simple to use, but you have to mind front-end performance, because you can create updates loop, so-called updates loop, because something from the model modifying the view, and from the view modifying the model, and from the model modifying the view. So you can create loops. This is very important to keep in mind, because if you do not know exactly how it works, you can really have bad performance. So just keep it in mind. So, 3 solutions compared. React, the first one, is probably one of the most powerful rendering library at the moment. But remember, it is just a library. So when you want to add something, so for example, a routing system or something new, you have to add a library. And you can create a real mess of library. So you have to maintain a lot of libraries. So I think this is not so good, for example, for big projects. For big projects, AngularJS could be a better idea, because it is a full framework. You have a routing system, you have services, you have a direct injection system, and it's modular, for example. But the React community is very wide. So if it is the first time, you probably will find more documentation about React. You have to consider even this. And Vue is probably one solution in the middle, because it's very simple to use. It's very easy to embed in existing environment. And we could say that it's a real short time to market solution, because it's very easy to learn. So there is no better framework. It really depends on your project. OK, now we have seen problems, how to solve them, technologies. Now we should understand if we should go headless and why. Okay, you should go headless if you want to avoid performance bottlenecks. Why? Because we are moving complexity from server side to client side. So your infrastructure will be offloaded. This is why. This is one of the main reasons. If you want to deliver a custom tailored user experience, because you are creating a front-end experience from scratch, so you can just do everything your customer asks, even the wild imagination stuff. And you can go omnichannel, because if you use Magento as an headless Magento, you have one source for multiple devices, for example. So you could have a website, a mobile application, an information kiosk connected to the same Magento. This is very important. And probably the most important is the last one. You have a high resilience while upgrading to release it across different releases. Because, upgrading from Magento, let's say 2.0 to 2.1 to 2.2, whenever you do this, you have to check if your front end is working, because if it is a custom front end, probably from Magento are coming different features, or they modified existing features. So you have to check for your front end. But moving headless, you can rely on service contracts on Magento 2. So calling the API, you always call the same API structure, and you have the same response model. This is very important. And another reason that you should consider while going headless is PWA. Raise your hand if you don't know what PWA is. Yeah, a few people, I know this, because it's a quite new word, but it's coming. It's the word of the moment, probably. PWA means Progressive Web Application. Do you remember progressive JPEGs? Raise your hand if you're old like me and you remember. Yes, OK. A lot of old people. Well, progressive JPEGs were images served in a low resolution, and then the details were coming later. So you had a very good user experience, because the image was returning very, very quickly. This is almost the same with PWA. So we have an application that is working even in low connectivity condition. Because people, today we are in London, we have 4G, but in smaller cities, or even in my country, I'm Italian, in big cities we have 4G, of course, but in smaller cities we have 3G. So it is not a good user experience to use a website via 3G. So PWA means that your application is working even in this kind of condition. because it is updated asynchronously using a technology called service worker. I will not go deeper on this, but it's very like the work that Magento is doing now. And the static cached contents are available even offline. A very good example of this technology is the Twitter website. Try it with your mobile. And talking about mobile, this is one of the main advantages of going headless. You can, if you are using AngularJS, you can, for example, reuse your code to create a mobile application based on Ionic. Ionic is a very powerful framework based on AngularJS, so you can just take pieces of code from AngularJS and make them work on Ionic in a web application, in a mobile application. And the same you can do with React and React Native. So you can reuse the code. This is very important because, if one of the problems is developing time, this is one of the solutions. Okay, just to say I'm not lying, and what I say is true, we did it. So we have a couple of case studies. The first one is a very big Italian customer. It's called Mondo Convenienza. We are talking about 1.6 billion of year revenue. So it's bigger than IKEA in Italy. So they had a very particular requirement about the checkout procedure. And we tried to make with Magento, but the Magento way was too expensive, so we decided to refactor. So changing Magento was too expensive, and we decided to create a decoupled React checkout procedure. And we did it with React.js, and this is real. I do not know if it's thanks to Magento because they moved from a custom solution last year to Magento 2, or it's because our checkout procedure, but they had a plus 26% of online sales. So this is it's a very impressive result for me. And the other one is Wine. We did not take part about the front-end design, but it will be based on React.js. This is a work in progress, so it is not still online. But we were consultant for the performance because the very first version of this website had a lot of performance issues for the same reason I told you before, cache. So the API were not cached. So we created that module I told you before, API enhancer, and we moved from 25 transactions per second to 350. This is very impressive. So, in conclusion, we have two main different approaches. The first one is the standard Magento way. The second one is headless Magento. Headless Magento could be more expensive for simple projects, but it will be cheaper if your project is going to be complex. Or I do not know exactly where that point is, but in our experience is almost when your customer is starting to ask modification over modification, customization over customization. So from that point, you are going to save your money. From the infrastructure point of view, no way. You are saving money from the beginning because your infrastructure will be almost offloaded. And just to say, again, I'm not lying, the community is starting to work on headless solutions. So this is real. And any suggestion about improving Magento 2 API is always welcome. So the final conclusions. We have seen that going headless means a better customer experience. And better customer experience means more conversions. A better performance means more traffic, more conversions, and more traffic, more money. And less infrastructure cost just means more margin. So there is just one question: what are you waiting for? Thank you very much. And I just say sorry for my English, but my Italian is better.
Any questions? It's working? Any questions?
How you manage situation with ACL when you try to use...
Try with the microphone. Because
how you manage the issue with ACL when you try to use API, because we faced with issues that, for example, product list couldn't retrieve via standard Magento ACL.
Are you talking about what kind of ACL? I'm not sure I understood the question.
When you should use Magento API, you have ACL rights. Not ACL, I mean
It depends
resource.
Yeah, it depends on how you configure, because you can even say that an API is accessible from everyone. So it's just from guest. So it depends on how you configure. If you want to use ACL, you probably have to include an authentication system inside your decoupled application. So you can just work around with this. $42 is not the right answer.
Hi. I'm wondering whether if you have a front-end that is completely implemented in AngularJS or React, do you have any experience what the SEO impact might be? So is there any impact on Google ranking, stuff like that?
This is a very good question.
Thank you.
So how do you say usually? Thank you for the question. I do not have an immediate answer because, you know, Google says that everything will be fine because we'll handle your website as it was a static website. This is what they say. But I think we do not have an observation period so long to say it is like they say. So as far as I know, you should not have any kind of impact. And you should even have a kind of search engine optimization in place. So I think you should go, even because a lot of people are moving to this kind of solution. So I think Google will adapt its algorithm to use this kind of websites. The answer is just 42, anyway. I was right.
The little bit I've heard, I don't actually have data on it, but I've heard that if you get a faster website, Google would consider pushing it up in the rankings rather than down. I think the question is more all the other search engines around the world, how well do they handle it? And from what I'm hearing is they're getting better and better, but Google are pushing this sort of field. They want it. They want more people to do this sort of things because they want faster sites and they want to sell you people more ads in the process. So they're interested in having a faster web. So, but I don't have hard data based on that. So
we have also to consider that AngularJS is made by Google, so, you know. So I think they will improve this. But as far as I know, in our experience, we didn't notice any kind of problem with. I don't know in the longer period, but I think it will just increase the website ranking.
But still, I think there are some rules you need to consider.
Well, of course, if you are going to use, for example, a single-page application, you have to...
Single-page applications won't work because you still need an URL you can index.
Yeah, this is why I put my slide... Where is it? Okay, here. Because if you want to have a SEO-friendly URL, you have to map them to the decoupled application. Unless you want to have catalog, product view, and the idea of the product, that I think it is not a good idea. This is why you should map your URL system to the decoupled front end. Of course, you have to pay the same attention as a standard website, even because they are almost the same at the end, because the URL is always the same URL. And you know that Google now is not browsing the HTML anymore. It is just trying to simulate a user experience. So.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
Did you need a lot of back-end customization for the API, or you only use?
No, few customization.
Okay.
For that project, I told you before, monoconvenienza, but the checkout procedure, no, we did a lot of customization because it was a very custom project. So we created a new workflow, so we needed extra API calls. But in a standard solution, you do not have to rely on many custom API calls. That's very good.
Going once. You didn't think I was going to get to 3, did you? Thank you very much.